I've camped all my life. Since I was a kid, my dad used to take me out into the woods. Taught me how to build a fire from wet pine needles, how to keep my food sealed away from animals, and how to read a topographic map even if I had no cell signal. I never considered myself someone who scares easily. I've been stuck in storms. I've had nights where raccoons clawed at the tent fly for food. I've seen bear prints that were fresh enough to still be filling with water. But what happened outside of Crescent City, what I experienced out there, wasn't like any of that. It was early September. The weather was still warm during the day, but dropped quickly at night. My girlfriend and I had planned the trip months before, just a quick weekend to decompress. Both of us worked full-time. She's a nurse and I'm a mechanic, so we didn't get out much. I picked the location, a small public campground just outside Crescent City, nestled in the redwoods but not too far from the coast. A mix of dense trees and mossy ferns, quiet and calm. A spot you'd assume would be perfect for a couple trying to get away from the noise of everyday life. We arrived Friday afternoon. The drive up was smooth. The last few miles twisted through towering trees and narrow, winding roads. You really feel how small you are out there. The campsite wasn't crowded. Maybe 4 or 5 other cars parked throughout the loop. We picked a spot at the far end, a little off to itself, with a clear view of the sky through the treetops and enough space for our 2-person tent and a fire ring. It was peaceful. The first night we set up our gear, had a small fire, and made a simple dinner, ramen and foil-wrapped sausages heated over the coals. We went to sleep a little after 10, the forest pitch black around us. No streetlights out there, just the quiet, the wind rustling the high branches, the occasional scurry of something in the underbrush. I fell asleep quickly. Saturday was uneventful in the best way. We hiked part of the Damnation Creek Trail, came back mid-afternoon, napped, read in the hammocks, and watched the sunset as we heated dinner again. That night felt just as still as the first, but sometime around 1 in the morning, I was pulled out of sleep by a sound I still can't completely describe. It started soft, like air escaping through someone's teeth, but slowly formed into a melody. I lay there in the dark, not moving, barely breathing, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The sound got clearer. Someone was whistling. The tune was unmistakable. When the saints go marching in, it didn't come from a speaker. It didn't sound mechanical or distant. It was close, very close, just on the other side of the thin nylon fabric of our tent. My pulse jumped. I didn't say a word. I didn't want to wake her yet. I strained to listen, trying to gauge where exactly the sound was coming from. The whistling continued, getting louder and slower, dragging each note out in a deliberate, almost mocking way. Then it stopped, for about 5 seconds, maybe less, and then the voice started, low, gravelly, male, not yelling, but just loud enough to cut through the still air. When you sleep here, you disrespect me, and when you disrespect me, you disrespect the US Marines. My mouth went dry. I couldn't even process what he was saying at first. I thought maybe I was still half asleep, hallucinating something from a dream, but he said it again, slower this time, firmer, like he was delivering a line from memory. When you sleep here, you disrespect me, and when you disrespect me, you disrespect the US Marines. I felt her stir beside me. She leaned up slightly, confused. I could feel her body tense as the words registered with her, too. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't even reach for the flashlight. Every instinct I had told me that whatever was going on outside, confronting it wasn't the answer. Then he started again, but this time he wasn't just repeating the same sentence. He began spelling something, loud, sharp syllables. F, L, E, pause, then louder. F, L, E. It wasn't shouted. It was worse. It was spoken like a threat, like an order, clear and steady. Then he started to whistle again. Same tune. When the saints go marching in, my heart thumped hard in my chest. I sat there for maybe 15 seconds, thinking. Then I quietly, carefully, began packing up the sleeping bags and stuffing loose gear into our packs without turning on any light. She mirrored me silently. No one said anything. We both knew what had to happen. We didn't unzip the tent until every single thing we could grab was ready to go. I slowly slid the zipper down, the tiny metallic clicks sounding impossibly loud. I peeked out, using only the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. There was no one in sight, no flashlight, no movement, nothing. But that didn't make me feel better. If anything, it was worse. I expected to see someone. Some messed up drunk guy standing near the fire ring or pacing around. But there was nothing but our dying fire and shadows between the trees. We broke down the tent in record time, tossed it into the trunk of the car, barely folded. I don't even think we took down the poles right. We just threw it in and slammed the doors. As we pulled away, the whistling started again. It was behind us. It was fainter now, but it was still there. When the Saints go marching in, clear as day, echoing through the redwoods. We didn't talk until we hit the highway. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind us or someone walking down the road. We drove south until we found a roadside rest area. It was one of those pull-offs with a few vending machines and a bathroom building. We parked under one of the lights and sat there until the sky started to lighten. Neither of us slept. We just sat in the car, windows up, doors locked, and waited. When the sun came up, we debated whether we should go back to get anything we might have forgotten. I didn't want to, not at all, but she reminded me that our cooler and a couple camp chairs were still there. So we cautiously made our way back around 9 a.m., nerves still raw. When we pulled into the loop, I saw a few of the other campers already up, milling around. One man walked over as soon as he saw us and asked if we'd heard that guy last night. I nodded. He looked tired, bags under his eyes, and told us the whistling and yelling had gone on until about 4 in the morning. He said the guy never showed himself, just wandered around the sites, whispering or chanting strange things, nothing that made much sense. A few campers called the local ranger's office, but no one showed up until later in the morning. Apparently, this wasn't the first time it had happened. One woman told me she'd heard something similar about a year back. Someone pacing the woods near the edge of the camp, repeating nonsense phrases and singing old gospel songs off-key. No one knew who it was or why he did it. Some thought it was a local with mental health issues. Others thought it might be someone living out in the woods. I grabbed our remaining gear fast and tossed it back in the car. Didn't even bother cleaning the fire pit or checking the surrounding area. I just wanted to be out of there. We didn't camp again for a long time after that. Even now, months later, I'll be laying in bed, half asleep, and I'll hear that tune in my head. That slow, broken version of When the Saints Go Marching In. And then I'll think of the man's voice, repeating that sentence like it was scripture. When you sleep here, you disrespect me. And when you disrespect me, you disrespect the U.S. Marines. There was nothing supernatural about it. No monsters, no ghosts, no hallucinations. Just a man. Or maybe someone who used to be a man but had broken down over time until only obsession and repetition remained. And for some reason, that small patch of woods just outside Crescent City was where he found meaning. Or at least where he thought he could scare meaning into others. I don't tell this story to scare people off from camping, but I do tell it as a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't what we make up. They're what other people carry with them into the dark. What's already out there, walking through the trees long after the fires have burned down, waiting for you to close your eyes. I've been camping solo since I was 20. I'm 39 now. In those 19 years, I've had a handful of moments that made me nervous. A couple close calls with bears, a night when I was convinced someone was walking around my camp, things like that. But nothing ever made me feel like I needed to stop altogether. I always came out okay. That changed 2 years ago. I planned the trip like I always did. I live in Minnesota, and I'd been itching to try a section of the Superior hiking trail that ran between Finland and Schroeder. This beautiful country up there. Dense forest, not a lot of people, and the elevation gives you some incredible views of Lake Superior. I had 4 days off work, and I packed light but smart. My tent, food for 4 days, water filter, GPS, extra batteries, knife, bear spray, rope, first aid kit, and a .22 I keep mostly for small animals or peace of mind. The first day went just fine. I parked at a small trailhead pull-off in the early morning. The first 3 or 4 miles were well marked and easy to follow. It was mostly uphill, but I expected that. The forest was quiet, no people, which was perfect. I made it to a clearing by a rock outcrop around late afternoon, maybe 5 or 6 miles in. There was a small fire ring where someone had camped before, and it was just off a stream I could hear trickling nearby. I pitched my tent, set up my gear, and made a fire before sunset. That night was calm, cold, but clear. I woke up once during the night. I don't remember hearing anything specific, but something felt off enough that I unzipped the tent and looked around with my headlamp. Nothing, just the trees and a bit of wind. I chalked it up to nerves and went back to sleep. The second day is when things started to get weird. I hiked about 7 more miles deeper into the trail, going farther west. I passed a couple trail markers, but after the 3rd hour of walking, they stopped showing up. The GPS was still tracking me along the route I planned, so I didn't think much of it. I figured maybe they stopped marking this stretch of the trail. Around late afternoon, I found another decent spot near a patch of boulders. The area was a little tighter than the night before, but I could wedge my tent in between some rock faces and trees for a bit of cover. I had to clear out some branches and debris, but I managed. It was around dusk when I first noticed something that didn't sit right. I had just finished eating and was walking a bit away from my tent to hang the food bag in a tree. As I turned back toward camp, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a bit of movement behind the rocks to the west. I froze. It wasn't big, maybe a person-sized blur, not distinct. Could have been a deer. I stood there holding the rope, staring into the trees for a long time, but there was nothing. I tried to shake it off. I reminded myself that this is nature. It's full of movement. Your eyes and brain make things up, especially in dim light. I finished tying the food up and went back to camp. But that night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening. No specific sound, no snapping twigs, just the feeling that something wasn't right. It was like my brain refused to settle. The next morning, things were worse. I stepped out of my tent just after sunrise, and I noticed something immediately. A small pile of sticks right next to the tent entrance, neatly stacked, not scattered, not windblown, stacked, like someone made a mini teepee out of branches. I didn't do that. I hadn't even gathered sticks in that spot. I stood there for a while just staring at it, trying to make sense of it. I walked around the campsite. No obvious footprints, but the ground here was rocky and hard-packed. Still, I should have seen something. No broken branches, no dragged gear. Nothing was missing, but that pile didn't make itself. I took the .22 from my bag and kept it on my hip for the rest of the day. I debated heading back, but stubbornness got the better of me. I figured maybe it was some weird animal thing, or even a joke by another hiker. The woods can mess with your head. I told myself I'd go one more night deeper in, and if anything else seemed off, I'd turn around. I hiked another 5 or 6 miles. The farther I got, the more overgrown the trail became. I had to use the machete to clear a few sections. I wasn't sure this part of the trail even got used much. It felt like it hadn't seen people in months. By mid-afternoon, I found a flat area at the base of a ridge. It was quiet. Too quiet, really. No bird noise, no squirrels, just the wind. It was thick with pine and spruce, and I had to clear a spot to get the tent up. I ate cold food that night. Didn't want to risk making a fire if someone or something was around. At some point, maybe 10 or 11 at night, I heard movement. Not the kind you hear from a rabbit or raccoon. It was slow, deliberate, heavy enough that I felt it in my chest more than I heard it. I didn't move. I was already lying down in the sleeping bag with my boots on. I had my flashlight in one hand and the .22 in the other. I didn't make a sound. The steps circled the tent once. I don't know how else to describe it. They were far enough away that I didn't see a shadow, but I knew whatever it was had made a full loop. Then it stopped. I held my breath for what felt like 10 full minutes. Then silence. Eventually, I heard it again, this time farther off, toward the ridge. Slow steps fading into the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, just waited for sunrise. When it was light enough to see clearly, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. My stomach dropped. On the side of the tent, someone had drawn a crude circle in the dirt. Not big, maybe 2 feet wide. Just a finger dragged through the dirt in one unbroken line, circling the tent. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a wind pattern. Someone made it. I didn't waste time. I packed my gear in 15 minutes flat and started back the way I came. I wanted out. I didn't care how long it took. I just wanted to see pavement again. I tried to retrace my route, but the forest looked different. I couldn't find some of the markers I remembered. I checked the GPS, and it told me I was heading southeast, so I kept going. About 3 hours into the hike, I found something that made my blood go cold. A pair of boot prints in a muddy patch. They weren't mine. The tread was different, deeper, and they were facing the direction I'd just come from. Like someone had followed me and then turned back. That was it for me. I stopped using the trail and started heading directly east, using the compass and GPS together. I figured if I just kept east, I'd eventually hit a road or the lake. It was rough going. Thick underbrush, fallen trees, steep climbs and drops. I pushed through it all. I didn't stop for breaks.
He barely drunk.
I just wanted to be out. As the sun started to dip, I came across what looked like an old hunter's blind. It was just a square of rotted wood propped between some trees, probably abandoned years ago. But what stopped me was what was inside it. Pile of bones. Dozens of them. Small. Animal bones, most likely. But they weren't scattered. They were laid out, arranged, some stacked in shapes, some formed into rough patterns. Circles again. Lines. It looked deliberate. Too deliberate. I didn't go closer. I just turned and kept walking. By the time the sun was gone, I found a narrow deer trail and followed it. I didn't set up camp that night. I walked until I couldn't anymore. I finally collapsed under a pine tree and dozed off with my back against the trunk and my gun in my lap. When I woke up, it was early morning. My legs were cramped and my mouth was dry. I kept moving. Around noon, I finally heard a sound that brought tears to my eyes. A truck. Couldn't see it, but I heard it. I kept going toward it, pushing through the trees like a madman until I burst out onto a gravel road. It wasn't the road I started on, but it was enough. A few hours later, after walking east on that road, a DNR truck came by and picked me up. I didn't tell the ranger everything, just that I got turned around, heard weird sounds, and wanted to be dropped back at my truck. He didn't ask too many questions. When I got back to the parking area, my vehicle was untouched. There were no other cars nearby. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting it. It's been 2 years now. I haven't gone back to that trail. I haven't even been camping alone since. I've tried to forget some of the details, but they come back in flashes, especially the circle. The way it was drawn with care. The fact that someone had followed me, watched me, and left no trace other than those quiet signs. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't a prank. It was someone who knew those woods, who lived in them maybe, and who wanted me to know I wasn't welcome. The scariest part is how easily it could have gone worse. I think about that a lot. I think about how if I'd ignored my gut again, if I'd stayed one more night, I might not have come out, and no one would have known where to look. Now, when people ask why I don't camp solo anymore, I tell them it's just age, that I'm too tired for roughing it like I used to. But the truth is, I've seen the kind of person who lives out past the trail, and I never want to see them again. I've camped alone for years, mostly in remote areas, and I've always preferred it that way. I'm not one for crowded parks or noisy campgrounds. I like silence, space, and being far enough away from everything that the world fades out and all I hear is the wind through the trees and the chirping of birds. My dog, Riley, is the only company I ever bring. He's a mixed breed, mostly lab with something smaller thrown in, but smart and alert, always tuned into things before I am. I trust his instincts more than I trust my own most days. This trip was supposed to be a quiet weekend away. I'd found a spot on a ridge just above a small creek, not far from a game trail I'd followed earlier that summer. It was out of the way, peaceful, and as far as I could tell, rarely used. The ground looked mostly level, and there weren't any obvious signs of past campers. No fire pits, no garbage, no worn patches of dirt. It was just wild grass, pine needles, and tree roots. I arrived early in the afternoon, set up my tent near a stand of tall spruce trees, and spent the evening reading, collecting kindling, and cooking over a small camp stove. The air smelled like cedar and moss. Riley sniffed around the area but didn't act strange or alert, which reassured me. He had a way of letting me know if something was off. When night fell, the temperature dropped fast. I zipped us both into the tent and lay down on my foam pad with Riley curled at my feet. I remember noticing something uneven under the floor of the tent as I adjusted my sleeping bag. At first, I thought it was a rock or maybe a tree root. The ground hadn't felt particularly bumpy when I set up, but I hadn't inspected every square inch either. As I shifted to get more comfortable, I noticed a softness under my left hip, like the ground had a bit of give to it. Not much, just enough to feel weird. I pressed my hand down through the sleeping bag and pad, expecting to feel something solid. Instead, it felt like packed soil that had a slight springiness to it, uneven like a patch of loose earth. I figured it was probably just some buried sticks or old roots that had rotted out. I didn't think much of it. I was tired, and the last thing I wanted to do was take the tent down to check the ground underneath. So I ignored it. The night passed mostly without incident. I woke up once to pee, and Riley sat up and listened to something in the woods for a while, but didn't bark or growl. Eventually, he laid back down and went to sleep. I followed soon after. I didn't feel uneasy, just tired. Morning came with clear skies and a light breeze. I boiled water for coffee and gave Riley his breakfast. He ate quickly, then wandered toward the edge of the tent and started sniffing near the spot where I'd felt the strange ground the night before. At first, I figured he was just smelling old food scent or maybe the imprint of my body from the night before. But then he started to scratch. It was the kind of digging he did when he smelled a buried animal, like a chipmunk or mole. He was quick, efficient, and focused, his front paws scooping away at the thin layer of dirt and pine needles beside the tent. I told him to stop, more out of habit than anything. He never listens when he's this dialed in. He kept digging until he exposed something hard and flat beneath the soil. Curious, I got up and pulled the tent back to see what he'd found. At first, I thought it was a piece of an old pipe or maybe some kind of metal lid. But as I brushed away the dirt with my hands, more of it was revealed. A rectangular metal grate, rusted and bent at the corners, like it had been tampered with or pried up at some point. It looked like a vent cover, the kind you'd see in a basement or crawl space. It had narrow slats and was bolted into what looked like a concrete edge. My stomach knotted a little. What the hell was a vent doing under the middle of a clearing in the woods? I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand what I was looking at. This wasn't the kind of area where people buried septic systems or dug out storm shelters. It was forest for miles, nothing developed anywhere nearby. No old cabins, no ruins. The nearest trailhead was 5 miles away. And this vent, it wasn't new. It looked old, like it had been there for decades. I got down on my hands and knees and peered between the slats. At first, all I saw was darkness, but when I moved to the side, I noticed a faint glimmer of light coming from within. Not sunlight, it was too dim and steady, like the kind of light you'd get from a dying flashlight or a low-powered bulb. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Riley was still sniffing and pawing at the edges of the grate, whining a little now. I tried to lift the vent, but it was stuck. I used my multi-tool to pry at one corner, and after a few minutes of work, the rusted bolts gave way. I managed to lift the cover enough to slide it aside, revealing a square opening about 2 feet across. Below, there was a narrow shaft with metal rungs built into the wall, like a ladder descending into a hole. It dropped down maybe 6 or 7 feet into what looked like a small underground room. I sat back, my heart thumping in my chest. I didn't know what I'd found, but I had the sense I shouldn't be here. The room below looked man-made. The walls were rough concrete, the floor packed dirt. There were no pipes, no visible wiring, but the light, coming from a small, battery-powered lantern, was sitting on the ground in the corner. A pair of dirty blankets lay in the opposite corner, along with an empty water bottle and a crumpled plastic bag. Someone had been living down there. Maybe not recently, but not long ago either. I didn't go down. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. A hidden crawl space right under my tent. Someone had carved this thing out, covered it up with just enough dirt to hide it, and left a vent on top like it was nothing. If Riley hadn't scratched at the ground, I never would have known. I would have slept the night right over it, none the wiser. My mind began racing. Was this a survival shelter? A hideout? Was someone still using it? The lantern still had power, which meant someone had been down there recently enough to change batteries. But there were no signs of food, no clothes, no personal items beyond the blanket and bag. It wasn't a prepper cache. It felt more temporary, like someone had needed a place to hide. For a night or a week or maybe longer, I started scanning the trees around my site. The woods had seemed peaceful when I'd arrived, but now they felt still in the wrong way. Not quiet, but watchful. I didn't see anyone, and Riley wasn't acting like someone was nearby, but that didn't mean much. Whoever had made that space knew how to stay out of sight. I made a decision fast. I repacked my gear, collapsed the tent, and loaded everything into my backpack. I left the vent open, the cover tilted to the side. If someone came back, they'd know someone had been there. I wasn't trying to hide it. The hike out was long and silent. Riley stayed close to me the whole way, his ears back and his body tense. We didn't stop until we reached the car. Once I got home, I sat in the shower for 20 minutes trying to calm down, but the feeling of that soft ground under my back still stuck with me. I reported the site to the local Forest Service anonymously. I didn't want my name attached to it. A few weeks later, I went back online and checked their reports. No mention of a shelter, no warnings posted, nothing about underground spaces or suspicious activity. It was like nothing had ever been found. I haven't camped alone since. It's not fear that stops me. It's the realization that I'd slept directly over a hole in the ground. A place someone had dug out and hidden. Place meant to go unnoticed. There's no telling who had made it, how long they'd been there, or why they were hiding underground. But they had been right beneath me while I slept, and I'll never forget that soft, uneven spot under my sleeping pad, because now I know it wasn't rocks or rotted roots. It was hollow ground, and someone had been there before me. Maybe not that night, but not long before. I had always found peace in the isolation of remote places, where the sounds of civilization felt miles away and nature had its own rhythm. There's something special about being alone at a lake, surrounded by nothing but trees and water. It gives you space to think, reflect, and simply be. I had been fishing this remote lake for years, taking my time to find the perfect spot and enjoy the quiet serenity it offered. This particular trip, however, was different. It started off just like any other, but it ended up being something I would never forget. The lake I chose was tucked deep within the woods, far from any major roads or trails. It wasn't a popular spot, which suited me just fine. The water was clear, the fish plentiful, and the setting pristine. I had my tent set up right beside the shore, the fire pit crackling as the sun dipped below the horizon. The first evening was peaceful. I spent the night by the fire, listening to the croak of distant frogs and the rustling of the trees. The air was cool and crisp, just the way I liked it. But it wasn't long before I started noticing something strange. It was around midnight when I first saw the flicker. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from the campfire bouncing off the water. But when I looked again, I saw it more clearly. A small headlamp bobbing along the far side of the lake. It wasn't the soft glow of a campfire. It was a single, bright light moving across the water. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, but the figure was too far away to identify. I waited for a moment, expecting someone to call out, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement beyond the light, just the eerie stillness of the night. I figured maybe it was another fisherman, someone out there like me, enjoying the quiet of the night. But the more I watched, the more uneasy I felt. The light moved slowly across the water, just above the surface, weaving back and forth. A few minutes passed, and I called out, my voice carrying into the darkness, "Hey, you out there?" But the response never came. I waited a bit longer, thinking maybe the person hadn't heard me. But then the splashing started, faint at first, like the sound of something moving through the water. The headlamp flickered again, then disappeared into the distance. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where I had seen the light, my curiosity growing, but also a nagging sense of discomfort settling in my chest. There was something strange about it. The way the light moved, the sound of the splashing. It didn't feel right. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when things were off, and this felt off. I decided to dismiss it as nothing, but that night, sleep didn't come easy. I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds of the night, unable to shake the image of the headlamp across the water. Every creak of the trees, every ripple in the lake, made me uneasy. The stillness was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of that faint splashing. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, but I kept waking up every few hours, staring out at the lake, half expecting to see that light again. The next day, everything seemed normal. The sun was out, and the water glistened under its warmth. I went fishing, cast my lines, and spent a few hours trying my luck with the fish, but I couldn't shake the memory of the headlamp. That evening, as dusk fell and the shadows grew long, I found myself watching the lake again, waiting for that flicker of light. Sure enough, just as the sky darkened, I saw it again, that same headlamp moving across the water. I didn't call out this time. Instead, I grabbed my paddles and slipped my canoe into the water, pushing off from shore. The lake was eerily quiet now, the only sound being the gentle splash of the oars in the water. I moved cautiously toward the light, my eyes locked on the small, flickering beacon as it bobbed in the distance. It was hard to tell how far away it was, but the more I paddled, the closer I got. As I neared the spot where the light had been, I felt a strange unease creep up my spine. It was almost as if the light was leading me, drawing me into something. The splashing sounds were louder now, like something large was moving in the water, but I couldn't see anything. No figures, no shapes, nothing but the dim glow of the headlamp, which now seemed to be closer to the surface of the water. The light's movement was erratic, almost frantic, like someone was struggling or trying to swim. My heart raced as I paddled harder, eager to reach the source of the noise. I told myself that it was just another fisherman, maybe someone who had fallen in the water or gotten stuck. I had to check. It wasn't right to ignore it. I reached the area where the light had last been seen, and I scanned the water, but there was no one in sight. Then, as I looked down into the dark, murky depths, I noticed something strange. A canoe was partially submerged near the shore, its hull dipping beneath the water, as if it had been there for days. I stopped paddling and drifted closer, my eyes fixed on the half-sunken boat. My stomach turned when I saw that it wasn't empty. Inside, something was floating, a half-eaten sandwich. It bobbed in the water, a few crumbs floating free, the sandwich itself looking wet and soggy from being submerged. The sight sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't make sense of it. Who leaves a sandwich like that in a submerged canoe? It was as if whoever had been out there just vanished. The canoe wasn't damaged. There was no sign of a struggle. But the sandwich was so out of place, like a piece of a puzzle that didn't fit. I quickly pulled my canoe back, my mind racing. My gut told me something was wrong. Why was the boat left like that? Where had the person gone? The air felt heavy, and I suddenly realized how eerily quiet the lake had become. The splashing sounds had stopped completely. Everything was still. I didn't stick around to find out more. I paddled back to my campsite as quickly as I could, my mind spinning with possibilities. When I got to shore, I scrambled out of the canoe and packed up my gear. There was no way I was staying another night out there. Whatever had been going on at the lake, I didn't want to be part of it. I made my way back to the car, the whole time glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, anything, watching me from the woods. But there was nothing, just the deep, unsettling silence of the wilderness. I reported the canoe and the sandwich to the rangers, but when they checked, they found nothing. No sign of anyone missing, no explanation for the canoe or the strange scene I'd discovered. I even went back to the lake a few weeks later, but the area where I had found the canoe was perfectly undisturbed. The lake looked as peaceful as ever. I don't know who had been out there or why they left their boat like that, Maybe it was just an abandoned canoe. Maybe it was just an accident. But that half-eaten sandwich still haunts me because it felt like a sign, like someone had left it behind, and for some reason they didn't want me to find them. Or maybe they just didn't care anymore. Either way, I'll never forget the sound of that splashing, the flicker of the light, or the strange emptiness of the lake that night. Something was out there, and I still can't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me to look a little closer. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. I needed the time alone to escape from the demands of daily life and just reset my mind in nature. The place I chose was deep in a forest far from any roads or campsites. I liked the idea of complete isolation, far from any distractions. The hike in was peaceful enough. The air was fresh, the trees tall and comforting, and I even managed to find a beautiful spot near a small creek to set up camp. I thought it would be the perfect place to spend a couple of nights with nothing but the sounds of nature around me. That first night went as expected. The campfire crackled, the smell of burning wood filled the air, and I cooked a simple dinner, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. As the sun sank lower and the night took over, I settled into my tent, the warmth of the fire still lingering in the cool air outside. I lay back on my sleeping bag, staring up at the mesh ceiling of the tent, letting the night silence settle over me. But then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, heavy breathing. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a distant animal, but the breathing was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was close, too close. I froze. My heart started to beat faster, and I strained my ears trying to listen. It sounded like someone or something was standing right outside my tent. The breaths were deep and labored, slow but steady. I tried to convince myself that it was just some animal, maybe a deer or a bear, though that seemed unlikely this far in. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. I lay there, unmoving, trying to control my breathing, trying to listen harder, to determine if I was imagining things. But the heavy breathing didn't stop, continued, and it was getting louder, almost as if it was drawing closer to my tent. Panic crept up my spine. I had read about people encountering mountain lions or other large predators, and I wondered if that's what this was. Maybe I had set up camp too close to some sort of predator's territory. But then I remembered the bear bells on my pack, the extra precautions I had taken. I was too far out for anyone to be wandering around. No one could be this close, not without me noticing. I told myself to stay calm, that I should wait and see if it passed. Maybe the animal would move away, and I could get some sleep. But the longer it went on, the more certain I became that this wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too methodical. It was as if someone, or something, was standing outside my tent, just breathing, waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight beside me, clicked it on, and unzipped the tent flap slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. I shoved my head out, shining the light into the darkness. The beam swept over the ground, across the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of any animal or person. The forest was still, almost unnervingly quiet, except for the sounds of the creek and the rustling of the wind. The breathing had stopped the moment I unzipped the tent. But now I was even more unsettled. I couldn't explain it. Who or what had been there? Why had I heard those breaths so clearly, so close? I spent the rest of the night in a half-sleep, constantly alert, expecting the breathing to return. But the night passed without incident, and by morning, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it had been some animal, a large one, and I had been too worked up. The forest had a way of playing tricks on your mind, making every sound feel ominous. But then came the second night. I woke up again in the middle of the night, only this time, the breathing was even louder, much louder, and it was even closer. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding in my chest. The breaths were coming in quick, heavy bursts, almost like a person was standing right outside my tent, panting right next to me. The sound was so close, it felt like it was coming from just inches away. I reached for the flashlight again, my hands trembling slightly. I didn't unzip the tent immediately this time. I couldn't bring myself to. Instead, I just lay there, listening, trying to understand what was happening. The breathing was fast now, erratic. It sounded almost frantic, like something was in a state of distress. My mind raced through possibilities. A wild animal caught in a trap? A person, maybe someone who was lost or injured. The seconds felt like hours. I was terrified, but I knew I needed to stay calm. I couldn't afford to panic, not when I had no idea what I was dealing with. After what felt like an eternity, I grabbed my knife from my pack and started planning. I couldn't just sit here hoping whatever it was would leave. I had to do something. I decided I needed an alarm, something that would let me know if this thing, whatever it was, tried to get closer to my tent. I quickly got to work, tying a tripwire to the trees just outside my tent, connecting it to a few cans I had in my food stash. The plan was simple. If anything or anyone walked through the tripwire, it would trigger the cans to crash to the ground, alerting me. It wasn't much, but it was something. By the time I was finished setting it up, I could hear the breathing again. It was still close, but this time it was almost like the person or animal was pacing, moving around the tent. I lay back down, trying to force myself to relax, but my heart was racing. Every creak of the tent fabric made me jump. I laid there for what felt like hours, straining to listen, but eventually, the breathing stopped. My body was shaking with tension, and I could barely keep my eyes open, but I fought the urge to sleep. I had to stay awake. I had to wait for the tripwire to do its job. The minutes ticked by. The wind rustled the leaves outside, and the creek gurgled in the distance, but the heavy breathing never returned. I thought maybe it was over. Maybe whatever had been out there had finally given up. I started to drift off to sleep, but just as I closed my eyes, I heard it again. The breathing, only this time it was right next to my head. I could feel it. I could almost hear it in my ears, so close, like it was right outside the mesh of the tent wall. I snapped my eyes open and held my breath, not daring to move. My heart was pounding, and my skin felt cold, clammy with fear. My hand fumbled for the flashlight again, but this time, before I could make a move, I heard a sharp sound, the cans falling to the ground with a loud crash. I froze. The tripwire had gone off. Something had triggered it, but I heard no footsteps, no movement. It was just the cans. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent flap in one swift motion. My heart was in my throat. I shone the light outside, expecting to see something. A person, an animal, anything. But again, nothing. The forest was still. No one was there. No sign of anyone. No footsteps. No evidence of anyone having been near my tent. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest, but I quickly stuffed it down. I had to stay focused. I shone the light around, scanning the area, checking every tree, every shadow, every movement in the distance. But everything was calm, too calm. I couldn't explain it. My mind raced through every possibility. An animal, a person, maybe someone else camping nearby, but the breathing, the way it was right by my head, it didn't make sense. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person either. It was something different, something I couldn't explain. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, constantly listening, waiting for the sound to return. But it never did. The breathing never came back. The tripwire had gone off, but there was no sign of anyone or anything, just the silence of the forest. By morning, I packed up my camp in a rush, not even bothering to cook breakfast. I didn't want to be there anymore. I didn't care if it was all just a coincidence or some weird trick of the mind. I wasn't sticking around to find out. I hiked back out of the woods, and when I reached the trailhead, I didn't look back. I still don't know what happened that night, and I don't think I ever will. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was something else. But I'll never forget that heavy breathing, that sound of something too close, too real. And I'll never go back to that spot again. I had always been the kind of person who relished the solitude of nature. I'd grown up camping with my family, and as I got older, I started venturing out on my own. There was something deeply satisfying about the quiet of the woods, The way the trees whispered with the wind, the birds called, and the sound of a nearby creek flowing. It was my escape, a place where everything else in the world seemed so far away, where I could just be. That weekend, I decided to camp with a few friends at a site deep in the woods. It wasn't a popular campground, so there was hardly anyone around. The kind of place where you felt like you were in the heart of the wilderness, isolated from the world. We set up camp on a small rise, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. It was late afternoon when we arrived, just in time to set up before sunset. The weather was perfect, not too hot, not too cold, just a hint of a breeze. We spent the evening talking around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and catching up on life. By the time we headed to our tents, the moon was high and the fire had died down to glowing embers. The next morning was crisp and clear. I woke up early, just as the sun began to creep through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. I was still half asleep when I stepped outside to stretch my legs. The air was cool, refreshing, and there was the smell of fresh pine needles. As I wandered around the campsite, I noticed something odd. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a small patch of tarp sticking out of the ground near the edge of our site. At first, I thought it was some piece of trash someone had left behind. Maybe an old camping mat, maybe a broken tarp. But it seemed strange that someone would bury a tarp. It wasn't exactly the sort of thing you would just toss aside, and it seemed far too well hidden to be an accident. I walked closer to inspect it. The tarp was buried at an angle, almost as though someone had tried to hide it but hadn't done a very good job. A portion of it stuck out of the dirt, revealing the dull gray fabric. The edges had already started to fray, and there were signs of wear on the material. I crouched down and brushed away some of the dirt. As I did, the smell hit me, musty, damp, and faintly rotten. It made my stomach turn. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a nearby stick and started digging around the edges of the tarp, carefully clearing away the dirt. At first, I didn't think much of it, just annoyed by the unpleasant smell. But the more I dug, the more I realized there was something underneath. Finally, after a few minutes of digging, I pulled the tarp back completely. Underneath, partially exposed, was a moldy sleeping bag. It was dark green, almost black with rot, and the fabric had a slick, damp sheen to it. I hesitated for a moment, staring at it. It didn't seem like something someone would leave behind on purpose, not intentionally. It was too out of place. My heart started to race, and I felt a little uneasy. I moved the sleeping bag aside and found old, rotted clothing underneath. Faded jeans, a flannel shirt, and what appeared to be a pair of boots. They were caked with dirt, and the clothes had an awful, musty odor to them. There were also some other things buried beneath the pile, but I couldn't quite make them out. I was starting to feel deeply uncomfortable, like I was intruding on something I wasn't meant to see. I called out to my friends, who were still in their tents, to come over. They were just as baffled as I was. We all stared at the scene in silence, trying to figure out what to do next. This was no ordinary campsite find. I had been camping for years, and I had never come across anything like this. The clothing was decayed, old, but how old? The sleeping bag was in terrible shape, but it didn't look like it had been there for decades. It looked like something that had been buried recently. Too recently. The smell, the dampness, everything about it felt wrong. We decided to report it to the rangers. A couple of my friends hiked back to the ranger station to inform them about what we had found, while I stayed behind to keep an eye on the site. It felt strange to just leave the site like that, but we agreed that it was the right thing to do. We didn't want to take any chances. The rangers arrived about an hour later. They were skeptical at first, brushing it off as a prank or some old discarded camping gear. But once they saw the tarp and the contents, they took it seriously. They started searching the area around the campsite, examining the dirt and the surrounding trees for any signs of a struggle or anything unusual. But they didn't find anything. No footprints, no signs of a recent campsite, no other clues. The rangers looked at us, confused. "This is strange," one of them said. "We haven't had anyone in this area for months, and there's no record of anyone camping here recently." The other ranger agreed. "Whoever left this must have buried it a long time ago, but we haven't had any reports of missing persons out here." I didn't feel reassured. Something about the whole situation felt off. The rangers said they would file a report, but they didn't seem convinced. After a brief discussion, they decided to leave, saying they'd check with their headquarters to see if there had been any reports of missing campers or anyone else in the area. They promised to come back and check again, but I didn't get the sense that they thought it was anything serious. We stayed at the campsite for the rest of the day, but none of us felt comfortable. The place felt different now. I kept imagining the sounds of footsteps in the woods, the wind carrying whispers through the trees. As the sun dipped lower, we started packing up. Something about the scene, about what we'd found, gnawed at the back of my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't meant to find it. That night, we left the campsite and hiked out, heading back to the ranger station to get a better idea of what we should do. But when we arrived, the rangers told us something that completely baffled us. "No ranger was sent to that area this week," one of them said, "and there's no record of any campers being out there recently." I froze. "What do you mean? We just saw you earlier today. You came out and checked the site." The ranger shook his head. "No, we didn't. I'm not sure what you're talking about." We stood there in disbelief, trying to make sense of it. But no matter how much we pressed them, they insisted that no one had been sent out that way. No rangers, no search teams, nothing. I don't know what happened that night, but I can't get rid of the feeling that something was wrong. That tarp, the sleeping bag, the clothes, it felt like a sign, but a sign of what, exactly? We all agreed to leave the area. The unease we felt just didn't sit right. The strangest part of it all came when we returned to the campsite the next day. The tarp was gone. It wasn't just moved, it was gone. There was no sign of it, not even a trace of dirt where it had been buried. The ground was smooth, untouched. It was as if it had never been there. We searched the area again, hoping to find some clue. Maybe it had been moved, maybe the rangers had taken it. But there was nothing, no evidence of anything. The site looked completely normal, almost as though the day before had never happened. I still don't know what to make of it. I don't know if we stumbled upon something that we weren't supposed to see or if it was all just some bizarre coincidence. All I know is that after that trip, I never went back to that part of the woods. I don't think I ever will. It's been years, but every time I think back to that campsite, I get that same feeling, like we weren't supposed to be there. And whatever was buried under that tarp, whatever that clothing belonged to, I don't think it was meant to be found. We had been planning this camping trip for months, and we were all eager to get away from the city and spend some time together in the wild. The idea of being in the middle of nowhere, far from the noise and distractions, seemed like the perfect way to reset. My wife, our 2 kids, and I had picked a spot deep in the woods, away from the usual campsites, a quiet place where we knew we wouldn't run into many people. We arrived at our site late in the afternoon, just as the sun began to dip below the treetops, casting everything in a golden light. The kids were excited to explore, and my wife was already unpacking the tent while I set up the fire pit. The air smelled fresh, and everything around us seemed peaceful. We spent the next few hours settling in, gathering firewood, and talking about how amazing it would be to be so far out in nature for a few days. By the time dusk settled in, the sky was turning a deep shade of purple. The temperature dropped a little, but the air was still comfortable. We had just started cooking dinner over the fire when a vehicle pulled into the clearing near our campsite, making me pause mid-stir. The headlights shone brightly through the trees, cutting into the darkness. I watched as a ranger stepped out of the vehicle, his uniform illuminated in the glow from our fire. He had a stern, but not unfriendly, expression, and his boots crunched on the gravel as he approached our site. "Evening," he said, nodding at us. "Mind if I have a word?" I stood up from the campfire and walked toward him, trying to get a read on the situation. I could tell by the way he was looking around that he wasn't here for a casual chat. "Something wrong?" I asked. He hesitated for a moment, then looked back toward the trees as if scanning the horizon, making sure no one else was around. "I'm just here to let you know that there's a storm coming through tonight. I'd suggest you pack up and leave. It's going to be a bad one." I was surprised. We hadn't heard anything about storms in the forecast. We had checked the weather reports before leaving, and everything seemed clear. But here he was, telling us there was a storm we hadn't prepared for. The ranger continued, his voice calm but firm. High winds, heavy rain, and possibly some lightning. It'll hit around midnight or so I'd recommend getting out before then. It's not safe to stay out here when conditions get that bad. The storm's supposed to hit fast, and it'll come in hard. I glanced over at my wife, who was still by the fire, stirring the food. She seemed unaware of the ranger's warning, but I could see her starting to look concerned. How long do we have? I asked. Is it that serious? He nodded once, his face grim. Yes, it's serious. If you don't want to risk it, I'd suggest leaving as soon as possible. I'll be heading back to the station once I'm done here. There was something about the way he spoke that made me feel uneasy, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. He wasn't overly insistent, just matter-of-fact, like this kind of thing happened all the time. I turned to my wife again, who was now standing with the kids. We need to pack up, I said. The ranger says a storm's coming. She didn't argue, but she looked worried. Packing up a campsite in the dark would be a hassle, and I could tell the kids didn't want to leave either, but we all knew better than to ignore warnings from the rangers. We had been camping long enough to know that the weather in the mountains could turn dangerous without much notice. We hurried to gather our things, stuffing sleeping bags and gear into bags as quickly as we could. The kids weren't exactly happy about it, but they followed directions without much fuss. We made sure everything was packed tightly, and the tent was folded up and stashed away in the car as fast as possible. The ranger didn't stick around to help, though. He had finished his warning and was already heading back to his truck, which was parked on the edge of the clearing. As we loaded the last of our gear into the car, we watched him drive off into the night. The headlights disappeared into the trees, and we were left in a strange silence. It didn't feel quite right, but we didn't argue. We were already behind schedule, and the ranger had given us a valid reason to leave. We started the drive back to the ranger station, hoping to make it there before the storm hit. The roads were rough, and the trees seemed to crowd in on us the farther we drove, but the atmosphere in the car was strangely calm. The kids were tired, and my wife kept glancing nervously at the sky, but the drive was otherwise uneventful. We got to the ranger station a little over an hour later, well past midnight. When we arrived, I parked the car and we all piled out, stretching our legs and looking around. The station was quieter than usual, the lights dim, with only a few cars parked nearby. I walked up to the door and gave it a couple of knocks. A few moments later, the door opened, and a ranger I hadn't seen before greeted us. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, looking slightly surprised to see us. I explained the situation, mentioning the ranger who had stopped by our campsite earlier that evening. I told him that the ranger had warned us about the storm and that we had packed up and left as a result. The ranger at the station blinked, clearly confused. "Storm? There's no storm on the schedule," he said, his eyebrows furrowing. "We've had no reports of any bad weather moving in, and no one's been sent out to your site this week." I felt a sudden chill run through me, as if the ground had shifted beneath my feet. The ranger at the station was clearly puzzled, and I could tell he wasn't trying to make a joke. "Are you sure?" I asked. The guy was in a marked vehicle. He said the storm would hit soon. The ranger shook his head. "We haven't had anyone out there in days. No storms coming either. It's clear skies right now." I stood there, unsure of what to make of it. I thought back to the ranger who had stopped by our campsite, his calm warning, his uniform, the marked vehicle. Everything seemed so normal, so convincing. But now, in the cold light of the ranger station, it didn't make any sense. My wife looked equally unsettled. "Are you telling us we were sent off for nothing?" she asked. The ranger didn't have an answer, but he did give us a strange, sympathetic look before turning to check the station's records. We left without further discussion, heading back to our car, a sense of unease hanging heavily in the air. The storm never came, and the road back to our campsite felt far too quiet. We didn't talk much on the drive back. The kids were asleep in the back, unaware of the strange turn of events. When we got to our campsite, The tent was still packed up and everything was just as we had left it. The night was still clear, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. But something about it didn't feel the same. I can't explain what happened that night. Maybe it was a simple mix-up, or maybe something else was at play. We didn't see that ranger again, and no storm ever came. The whole thing felt too surreal to be a coincidence, but I'll never know for sure. We packed up the next morning and left, the memory of that strange encounter lingering like a shadow. I've thought about it many times since, but the one thing I'm sure of is this. We were warned and we left, but there was no storm, and the ranger, he wasn't who he said he was.